r/AskReddit. Serious, bullies of Reddit whose victims committed suicide. How did it affect you? I've felt pretty awful about this my entire life. When I was 15 or so, we had this one kid come and hang out at our table during lunchtime quite often. The reason my friends made fun of him was for no reason other than he was just a weird kid. Now I personally didn't join in the ragging. I actually thought he was pretty funny, but I never stopped my friends from doing it and usually laughed at their jokes, so I'm no less guilty than anyone. One guy was really bad on him. He wasn't a good person at all. He didn't have many interesting things to say, so he used making fun of others as a way to fit in, I suppose. He craved attention and us laughing at his jokes was his way to get it. He ducking constantly went after this kid, to the point where if he said anything at all the guy would say some comment to make fun of him over it. He stopped coming to our table after a couple of months and I would only ever see him sitting in some side hallways eating lunch alone or whatnot. Over the summer he jumped in front of a car and killed himself. No note or anything, but everyone knew why. After learning more about him, he was actually an awesome kid. Played football for some clubs, really great at drawing, and all sorts of other things. Had he been given the chance to contribute to conversations, he would have been liked and adored as anyone else. Bullying is never okay, and being silent and letting it happen around you is just as bad. For some reason or another, some kids just unfairly become targets and that leads to all the a-holes in the world taking advantage of them. It's something I've always been ashamed of, and I've honestly tried being as nice to everyone around me as much as I can. But there was literally dozens of moments I could have told my friends to cut it out and they would have listened to me, but I didn't. I never said anything. I just always let that shit happen around me. R.I.P. Steve. When I was in high school I was kind of a hybrid weird kid bully. There was this senior who always used to duck W me. I think his name was Glenn. He used to punch me in the arm, back, whatever, full force out of nowhere and tease me about anything and everything. One day I had enough and went full bully mode on him. I'm pretty physically imposing now, but I wasn't then, so my weapon of choice was wit. I proceeded to just duck and destroy him. I tore into him for like 10 minutes. I blasted everything about him from his physical appearance, intelligence, and socioeconomic standing. I ended the most ducked up thing you can say to a person. Nobody would give a shit if you killed yourself. That weekend he hung himself in his closet his karate belt. There was some ducked up suicide pact going on in my high school and nobody who heard me lay into him thought it was my fault. It still really ducked me up for years. I started using and the guilt just ate me up. I've since got my shit together, but I think about the last words I said to that kid almost every single day. Wherever you are, Glenn, whatever the reason, I hope you're at peace. I was a bully from grades 2-8, reaching a peak at about grade 5 and decided consciously to stop being mean around grade 7. I was a young girl. My parents divorced the summer before grade 1. I had 3 older brothers who took it hard, so did I, and were rough with me. I learned to defend myself, became quite physically strong, and because I felt powerless in my home life I chose to find a sense of power in the schoolyard. I was physically abusive, punching, pushing, tipping people's desks over, wrecking kids' projects, and had a sharp tongue. I would go out of my way to sniff out insecurities and say any mean things I could to make a kid cry. It was quite mean. I was also a cyberbully. I remember telling one girl at my school over a messaging service that she was fat and ugly and no one would ever have sex with her. I'm still ashamed of that. This girl became severely anorexic and bulimic starting in grade 8 and by grade 12 was in the hospital and almost dead. I tried to reach out and apologize and be there for her. At this point I had done a 180 after heavy therapy in my earlier years, but I understood why she didn't want to talk to me. I saw her last year on my walk to work and I smiled and said hi. She had a baby in a stroller. I was really happy for her, but I still feel guilt for being such an awful human growing up. There are still a handful of people who have a very low opinion of me, although I came around and made a public apology for being a shitty person. But hurts run deep. Edit. Learned math. There was a girl named Carrie in my elementary school who was always considered a bit off, really quirky, and she didn't really have a lot of friends. Granted, I wasn't popular at that point in my life either, so Carrie kind of hung out with the people that I did. I remember her being bullied, and the leader of my group was mean to her as well. I may have laughed at the stuff said to her, but I never said any of the mean comments. Like others in this situation, I was too much of a wimp and afraid to turn into the target to stand up for her. That being said, her and I did hang out outside of school and I did consider her a friend. Plus, at the end of 6th grade, most of us would divide up and go on to middle school, so I just assumed we would all start fresh. The summer before middle school started, I found out that she had died. We were told that it was a freak accident, that she was wearing a scarf while jumping on the top bunk bed in her room, and her scarf got caught on her ceiling fan that was on and she hung to death. I don't believe that story for a second. Like I said, I hung out with her and had been to her house. There wasn't any room for her to be jumping on her top bunk. I really believe she committed suicide because of the bullying, and I still feel terrible when I think about this. I went on to be the recipient of some brutal bullying that resulted in my own suicidal thoughts and self-mutilation, so looking back, I wish I had been tougher because I ended up knowing her pain. It sucks. It's one of the absolute worst feelings in the world. R.I.P. Carrie. I'm sorry. I should have been a better friend to you. Edit. Since this has been recognized, I changed the name out of respect for her family. So, I got bullied a lot and then turned the tables and unknowingly, and then knowingly, became the bully. He killed himself after. I got tormented by a kid 1 year younger than me in elementary school. Non-stop. I was in 5th grade and already getting bullied. Weird name. Poor family, so I had cheap and nerdy clothes, etc. by my own grade. Then, he started in on me because I was an easy target. I took it for a few months because I had no choice. Finally, I was in a trailer bathroom. School had run out of capacity, so most of our classes were in trailers, including the bathroom, and he pushed me while I tried to frantically leave. I didn't know what to do, but he pushed me pretty hard. Without thinking, I kid slapped him in the face. I don't think anyone had ever responded that way, and he just started to tear up, almost cry, but not yet. I had a nervous laughter, and still do, and I jetted out of there. I then turned the tables. Next thing you know, I was calling him pretty boy, and his buddy had seen me hit him. Well, the name stuck, and now everyone started picking on him. A lot. Of course I baited it on. Suadu. I became a bully without really knowing it because it was easier to pile onto someone else's misery than face up to my own. Well, his parents pulled him from school about a year later. He moved districts because of me. I am so ashamed of my 5th grade self that it is sad. I wish I could have known that he was only picking on me because he probably had a rough life that I did not know about. I just used it as an easy out. He killed himself in 8th grade. I will never really forgive myself, but I will hope to teach my children that bullies are bullies because they have larger issues that we don't know about. Sorry for the rant, but this hit home. I hate looking back knowing that I was once the bully. TLDR. I turned the table on a bully and became one. His parents had to pull him from our school district and he killed himself 3 years later. I will always feel mostly to blame. I may be a bit late to the thread, but here's my story. In 5th grade, a new kid came to my school who wasn't in the best shape, was rather large, and he got a lot of bullying coming into the school. People would make fun of his size, while I stood there just watching it. Sooner, rather than later, I befriended him. He was really cool, into video games just like me, and we became good friends, but the bullying never stopped. His anger spiraled out of control. He started gaining more weight more rapidly than before. Shut himself from everyone, except for me really. 6th grade came around, and we were sitting at lunch. Everyone at the table was making fun of him, calling him fat, and the like, and I got fed up with it. I stood up for him. Finally, after not saying anything for a regretful while, my popularity level crumpled in on itself, and we both began to take heat. Later that day he thanked me, with tears in his own eyes, that no one has ever done anything like that for him in 6 years. Fast forward 6 years to 12th grade, me and him talked and had a bro-to-bro conversation. He told me he was going to commit suicide that night, but I changed his mind. Me not being a bystander anymore saved his life. Too long didn't read. Saved a life by not being a quiet beach. I know this will likely get buried deep somewhere, but I figured I would post my experience in the hopes that someone will take away something from it. Hell, maybe even stop to think about their actions. As always, for anyone that fits into those categories, feel free to share, and I apologize in advance for the length of this post. The first time I can remember actively wanting to die and fixating on the idea I was 8 years old. However, I am sure I harbored those same feelings, not truly understanding what they were even much younger than that. I was your typical bright-eyed kid who came from 2 awesome parents who would bend over backwards for me, and came from a home full of love and acceptance. Where I didn't find acceptance was the place as a kid where you are forced to spend most of your day at school. I was one of those kids that just never fit. I learned this early on. While I can't remember specific incidents that young, my parents tell me that even every day from kindergarten I would come home crying. My parents, being the awesome human beings they are, did truly try whatever they could to make me fit. It just never took hold and it continued. Not only was I emotionally tortured by my peers, I was also physically beaten on by them. And because I grew up in the 80s, kids will be kids and it was considered normal. However, normal for me was a personal and physical hell. At 8 years old, I don't think I had a grasp of what suicide was, but I did know what death was. Death at that age is told to us as a peaceful place, and that when someone dies they aren't in pain anymore. And that sounded like a dream come true. I went to a small elementary school. One of those nice schools where class sizes are small. Everyone knows everyone, including teachers, parents, etc. I learned very early on that the size of my school did not make it a more welcoming space. And I learned very early on that the adults in my school, the people who were supposed to educate me, were not my allies to stop anything that was happening to me. In fact, their tough love, kids will be kids approach, pointing out my downfalls, in fact just fueled the fire. They gave my peers all the ammo they needed, both in pointing out my faults, but just by allowing my peers to continue in their treatments towards me, they got more bold, violent, and emotionally damaging. Now I will fully admit I was not a tall, thin and lanky kid, and I was on the chunky side. I still have a few unwanted pounds. As a little kid, it was one thing to be told I was fat by my peers. It took on a whole new meaning when my gym teacher pointed it out in front of my entire class one day. I was maybe 9 or 10. By the time I was in grade 4, I had learned not to cry. I had learned to, when hit, insulted, screamed at, stuff stolen, broken, to just simply look away or down at the floor and nod. I truly believed I was nothing. I was fat, ugly, stupid, a troublemaker. However, in addition to learning how to become stone-faced, I learned to smile, and I learned to lie. My parents on many occasions did try and talk to other parents, my teachers, etc. It just never did any good. Often teachers would deem me out to be the troublemaker, or if I was like the other kids this wouldn't happen. Since these things were deemed my fault, and I believed this notion, and realized that my parents made it worse, I learned to smile. As soon as I got home, I would be smiling. My parents asked me how school was. It would be great. As I got in the upper grades, stories, rumors, comments, notes, still being beat up happened both from my peers and kids in upper grades. No social media in those days, but going to a small school might as well have been with how quick things spread. However, somewhere in that period around grade 5 or 6, I started to not be able to fake it anymore. While I didn't cry, and I didn't fight back, I did become self-sabotaging. And to put it bluntly, at that very young age I no longer cared. I was horrible to my parents, my brother. My grades were horrible. I didn't do homework, didn't care what the consequences ended up being, often would just do nothing in class. I just didn't want anything to do with the place. Of course my parents noticed this, and I was dragged to a very nice man to talk to about my feelings and behavior. Again, I had mastered the art of smiling. I had mastered the art of diversion. I said I got distracted, that I was tired, that sometimes I had trouble getting it. Anything this nice gentleman suggested that didn't hit on what was going on was fine with me. Cause in my mind adults weren't safe. It caused backlash. So the final result was that it was decided that I had ADD. Well, that backfired. I got another label, one that they could pump me full of prescriptions for. My parents, bless them, when I refused medication, were nice enough to tell the medical professionals off about it being my decision. as I am sure taking medication I didn't need would have thrown me for a loop. It was during this period that I penned my very first suicide note, and it was then along with crying every night, which was a nightly occurrence when no one else was around. I began to pray to then God, since I still had a concept of religion at that age. Every night that I wouldn't wake up the next day, I cried every morning because I realized it didn't happen. The cuts, bruises, material items, those things that ended up happening would go away, be replaced or fixed. Emotionally, however, I was broken. So utterly broken and truly just dejected. I could tell you stories of incidents that happened for days. In 7 and 8 I did gain some distance between me and the rest of my peers. However, I did this by missing out. If a school trip was happening, I didn't go. I preferred to stay back at the school by myself in the library and read, or do homework, etc. If there was a full day of some activity happening, I would just tell my parents I really didn't want to do it, wasn't interested, etc. So again, I could miss it, stay home, hell do homework. These things meant not being alone with them. It meant avoiding instances that couldn't be turned into fuel. It gave me more control. Even as a practicing atheist, I will tell you that I am ever so thankful that my mother is a Roman Catholic, because upon graduation of this hellish institution everyone is fed into a feeder high school based on their location of their elementary school. I went to a public grade school, but I realized and researched that my mother being a RC meant that I didn't have to continue this hellish experience with my peers, that I could instead go to a Catholic high school in the area, to which my parents agreed. So I escaped. And high school was better. I mean, there were the cliques and the standard high school stuff. And of course, you know, by that point I realized I was an atheist, so being in a Catholic school could be interesting at times. But overall it was okay. I had a small group of friends and I was content with them. I did in that time find a voice and a backbone, and became this outward human being that I wasn't before. So where is the lasting effects? I will tell you. At 28 years old I have very segmented and carefully regulated emotions. In fact, at 28 years old I hate to feel, and I will go out of my way to make sure I don't. Thankfully I managed to not be an alcoholic or a drug addict. I have a very large, very thick emotionally wall, and I trust no one at face value. Cynical like you wouldn't believe. I always have that nagging voice in the back of my head of you know what they really think about you, don't you? And most of all standard coping methods don't work for me. I've come up with my own. At 28 for the most part I am pretty happy-go-lucky, and I have to the best of my ability faced those demons. However, I learned that therapy, despite trying multiple times, didn't work. I have a hard time talking to someone who is supposed to be in a safe environment. To me that term proved to be bullshit at a very young age. Because of my experiences I choose to remain childless. I don't want to risk any of my offspring experiencing what I did. However, there is a silver lining, and that was that I survived, and somehow depression beyond those years was never an issue. I am happy in a relationship, went to college, have a great paying job. I mean, I am not perfect. I still have things I can work on, but can't we all? I do often wonder how it is that I survived, because if all that stuff had happened now instead of then, I don't think I would survive. Grades K to 8 almost feels like it didn't happen to me. I have detached myself from my childhood totally, and in a lot of ways during that time period I never got the typical childhood experience. I learned what I know to be more adult emotions and experiences very quickly. Some days when things hit the fan, and things suck at work, or I get mad and pissed off over some trivial thing, and lose it, I sometimes think of little 6, 7, 8, 9 etc-year-old me and how the hell I just managed to hold it all together. To keep smiling, because some days I sure as hell can't do it as an adult. Despite the pain of then, the memories, the leftover scars, the after effects. If you told me you could go back in time and change it all, I would truly say no. That 8-year-old little girl, who woke up every day wanting to die, who endured all that she did, she never gave up. That little girl, despite growing up, never really left. She instead became that little voice inside, my personal cheerleader, my driving force, the one that when I fall screams in my head to get up, and I am forever grateful for her. Thanks for listening, and I apologize again for the length. Edit. Thank you so much for whoever decided to bestow me with gold. I have never been glided before. There's personal information on my main that'd make my area and school easy to identify, and as a result, make the deceased easy to identify. I feel like that's disrespectful to him. So this is a throwaway. Too long didn't read. I strongly feel that I am responsible someone's suicide. Although indirectly, I bullied someone who in turn decided to bully someone lower on the food chain. That person ended up killing himself. I was a pretty typical kid gets bullied so kid turns into a bully as a defense mechanism story. I won't go into details, but I was a pretty big target until grade 10. Eventually I figured out that if I snapped back hard enough, people would leave me alone. It worked, except on one kid who I'll call P. He was the kind of guy who insists he's your friend even though he treats you like shit and you clearly want nothing to do with him. He'd beat the crap out of me. He'd call me all kinds of slurs and names. He destroyed my property. He threatened to rape me. All kinds of shit. And he'd never stop. P decided it'd be funny to take my bag and open a shaken up soda in it. All over my TI calculator and textbooks. It was a couple $100 in damages. In front of a whole lot of people. I snapped and verbally laid into him. Saying a lot of extremely vicious and humiliating things. Just a barrage of every below the belt thing I could think of. He tried to grab me to start a fight, but I punched him in the nose. Nobody stood up for him, and a lot of people clapped. P treated everybody the way he treated me. He went home crying. When he came back to school, he left me and most everyone else alone. P learned he couldn't mess with me or anyone I knew anymore, but he hadn't learned not to mess with people. So he went for someone lower on the food chain. There was a kid a grade below us that I'll call M. M was a target for bullying from the get-go because he just moved into town. He was fat, he was bratty, and he was a pathological liar/braggart. No matter who you were or what you knew, he thought he knew better, even when he very obviously did not. Long story short, nobody liked this guy. M was basically a perfect target for P. P hung out with him and treated him the way he treated me. Basically, it literally was only a week later that M shot himself. While I don't know the full extent of what P did or said to the guy, I know for a fact P is responsible. M hung out with no one else. P hung out with no one else. And P was a huge piece of shit. About a month after M's death, P was bragging to anyone who'd listen that he encouraged M to shoot himself. I don't know if he really did or not as he was prone to the pathological bragging thing too, but he definitely said he did, at least, for the most part. I don't regret much of what I said to P because he caused me a lot of grief. My home situation was never good, and because of the property he destroyed, it got a whole lot worse and I was briefly homeless. He very nearly drove me to my own suicide. I recognize my actions were inappropriate and there was probably a better way to handle it. But I don't regret that I finally got him to take the hint and leave me alone. Hindsight isn't always 20/20 though, so I'm not sure what better could be. But I'm certain there was a better way to go about it. I realized telling the teacher was an option. I got the good old fashioned there's nothing we can do. I still feel responsible for M's death. He wasn't my friend and I avoided him because I thought he was a dong. But that doesn't mean he deserved death. He probably was the way he was because of his own home life. Or whatever reason. I don't know and I have no way of knowing. All that I know is that a kid killed himself before he ever even learned to drive. Because a guy I hated needed a target that wouldn't fight back. And there's no excuse for that. I learned to evaluate the consequences of my actions more. And try harder to solve problems I have with people. It's a valuable lesson that I appreciate and try to pass on, but I definitely wish there had been a better way to learn it. I think of this quote a lot. Just because someone's pain is understandable doesn't mean their behavior is acceptable. Whoa, you made it to the end? You're a ducking beast. I'll cut you a deal. Smash like and subscribe for more curated content, bruh. It's free and that's a great price.